More than 200 political prisoners were burned to death at this concentration camp near Leipzig. Others, among the original total of 350 inmates, were shot down by German elite guards.
Humanity prides itself on its moral and civilized standards, yet it is not without its dark chapters. The Holocaust remains a profound scar on our collective history, revealing the depths of human cruelty. Notorious Nazi camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka were centers of unimaginable punishment. These sites are not merely relics of the past. They remind us of terrible times that mustn't be forgotten to ensure such atrocities are never repeated. Join us as we delve into the harsh punishments endured in Nazi concentration camps. Number 10. Trains of despair. The horror began long before the prisoners even reached the camps. The trains that crisscrossed Nazi-occupied Europe were far from ordinary. These weren't just vehicles. They were engines of mass murder, integral to the Nazis' final solution. Known as Sonderzüge, or special trains, these grim transports carried millions of Jews, Roma, and others targeted by the Nazi regime to their deaths in concentration and extermination camps. From as early as October 1941, these trains began their horrific journeys. They departed from ghettos and transit camps and headed straight to places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The journey itself was a form of punishment. The trains were not fitted with passenger cars, but with cattle cars, each designed to hold up to 50 individuals under normal circumstances. However, the Nazis crammed up to 150 people into these suffocating compartments. With only a small barred window and a bucket for a toilet, the conditions were unbearable. The stench of urine and excrement mixed with the desperate cries of the doomed passengers as the train rattled towards its final destination. It is hard to believe, but the Nazis charged for these rides to death. Victims were required to pay for their own transport to the camps, often being told they were purchasing a ticket to a new life. The standard rate was usually a set fee, but children under the age of 4 were often transported for free. For days, sometimes even weeks, the trains traveled without stopping, except to allow more important military trains to pass. Food and water were rarely provided, and many died from dehydration, starvation, or suffocation. The longest journey recorded took 18 days, from the Greek island of Corfu to Auschwitz, where all aboard were found dead upon arrival. Upon reaching their destination, the scene that awaited was just as horrifying. Guards armed with rifles ordered the disoriented passengers out of the cars. Weak, dehydrated, and terrified, many stumbled out only to be met with barking dogs and shouting SS officers. The SS quickly separated the passengers into groups, those fit for forced labor and those destined for immediate death in the gas chambers, which will be discussed later. Elderly individuals, the sick, children, and mothers with infants were often sent directly to their deaths. In some cases, these train rides were not just about transporting the victims, but breaking their spirit before they even arrived at the camps. The idea was to make them so weak and demoralized that resistance would be impossible. Even if they survived the journey, the psychological and physical toll was so immense that many perished shortly after arriving. These death trains, orchestrated with chilling precision, involved coordination between multiple government ministries, including the Reich Transport Ministry and the Reich Security Main Office. The trains were a low priority on the rail network, and often they sat idle for hours or days at a time, further worsening the suffering of those inside. The trains were not just a means of transport. They were the first stage in the extermination process, a brutal prelude to the horrors that awaited in the concentration camps. Survivors like Elie Wiesel and Simon Grambeau have recounted their experiences, describing how the trains robbed them of their humanity long before they reached the camps. Number 9. Medical experiments. In the hidden corridors of Nazi concentration camps, a different kind of horror unfolded, a twisted form of science that betrayed every ethical boundary. The medical experiments conducted during the Holocaust are among the most gruesome chapters in human history. The pursuit of so-called scientific knowledge became synonymous with unimaginable cruelty. These experiments were not conducted by rogue madmen in hidden laboratories, but by respected physicians and scientists, many of whom were affiliated with prestigious institutions. They were sanctioned and encouraged by the Nazi regime, which saw these experiments as a way to further their racist ideologies, enhance their military capabilities, and advance medical knowledge. regardless of the human cost. One of the most infamous figures involved was Dr. Joseph Mengele, often referred to as the Angel of Death. Mengele's work at Auschwitz-Birkenau is perhaps the most notorious. Arriving at Auschwitz in 1943, Mengele quickly rose to the position of chief camp physician. His interests were broad, ranging from the study of twins to experiments on individuals with physical abnormalities, such as dwarves. He was particularly obsessed with proving the superiority of the Aryan race. Under his direction, twins, often young children, were subjected to horrific procedures. These included blood transfusions between twins, injections of chemicals into their eyes to attempt to change their color, and even surgeries performed without anesthesia. Many of these experiments ended in death, and when they did not, the survivors were often killed to facilitate further study of their bodies. But Mengele was not alone in his crimes. At Dachau, high-altitude experiments were conducted to determine how long German pilots could survive in extreme conditions. Prisoners were placed in pressure chambers that simulated altitudes of up to 49,000 feet. The results were catastrophic. Many prisoners died, while others suffered permanent brain damage. In Ravensbrück, female prisoners were used as test subjects for experiments on bone transplantation and wound treatment. Women's legs were deliberately broken, and bones were removed or transplanted in gruesome experiments that often led to gangrene and death. These women were subjected to repeated surgeries, with some enduring up to 9 operations in a desperate attempt to repair the damage inflicted by the previous ones. Sterilization experiments were another horrifying chapter. Dr. Karl Klauberg, working at Auschwitz, developed a non-surgical method of mass sterilization. He injected a caustic substance into the reproductive organs of women, causing severe inflammation. The goal was to sterilize thousands of women in a single day, a process that led to severe pain, infections, and often death. Klauberg's methods were so brutal that even the Nazis were impressed by his efficiency, as they aimed to prevent inferior races from reproducing. Dr. Horst Schumann, another physician at Auschwitz, conducted experiments on X-ray sterilization. Male and female prisoners were exposed to high doses of radiation in an effort to destroy their reproductive organs. The results were devastating: severe burns, festering sores, and radiation sickness that often proved fatal. The experiments were ultimately deemed unsuccessful, leading Schumann to advocate for surgical castration as a more effective method. The scope of these experiments was vast, affecting thousands of prisoners across multiple camps, from testing the limits of human endurance to attempting to find treatments for wartime injuries. The Nazis turned their prisoners into unwilling subjects in a vast, cruel laboratory. Over 15,000 documented victims suffered through these experiments, though the actual number is likely far higher. Number 8. Gas chambers. Amidst the cold, calculated machinery of death that defined Nazi concentration camps, the gas chambers stood as the most chilling embodiment of their genocidal ambitions. These chambers were not just rooms, they were precision-engineered tools of mass murder, designed to exterminate as efficiently as possible. The origins of gas chambers trace back to the early days of World War II. The Nazis initially experimented with poison gas on patients with disabilities under the so-called euthanasia program. By the time the final solution was fully operational, gas chambers had become the central method for executing millions of Jews, Roma, and other targeted groups. These chambers were constructed in killing centers across Nazi-occupied Poland, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bełżec, and Chełmno. Here, they claimed the lives of an estimated 2.7 million people between 1941 and 1945. The process was deceptively straightforward, yet brutally effective. Upon arrival at a camp, those deemed unfit for labor, often the elderly, the sick, women, and children, were immediately separated from those selected for forced work. These individuals were told they were going to take showers for delousing, a cruel lie designed to prevent panic. They were herded into the gas chambers, often by the hundreds, where they were packed so tightly that movement was nearly impossible. The doors were sealed shut, and through vents or shower heads, Zyklon B or carbon monoxide gas was released. The agony inside these chambers was beyond comprehension. Zyklon B, originally a pesticide, was chosen for its lethal efficiency. Upon exposure to air, it released hydrogen cyanide, which would quickly fill the chamber. Victims would struggle for air, some trying to claw their way towards any perceived escape, but within 20 minutes, all inside were dead. The SS guards, who observed through small peepholes, ensured no one survived before the bodies were removed. After the gassing, Sonderkommandos, prisoners forced to assist in the operation, would enter the chamber to remove the bodies. These corpses, often twisted in their final throes of desperation, were stripped of any remaining valuables, such as gold teeth, before being sent to the crematoria for burning. The ashes were either buried in mass graves, dumped into rivers, or used as fertilizer, a grotesque final insult to the victims. As Soviet troops advanced in 1944, the Nazis attempted to destroy evidence of their atrocities by dismantling or blowing up gas chambers, but not all were completely obliterated. The ruins of these structures, along with testimonies from survivors, stand as harrowing reminders of the lengths to which the Nazis went to carry out their genocidal policies. Number 7. Death marches. As the brutal regime of Nazi Germany began to crumble in the final months of World War II, a new kind of horror emerged from the already unimaginable nightmare of the concentration camps. Death marches were a last desperate attempt by the Nazis to erase the evidence of their crimes and to continue exploiting their prisoners even as Allied forces closed in. The largest and most infamous of these death marches began in mid-January 1945 as Soviet forces advanced on Poland. On January 17, just days before the Soviets liberated Auschwitz, the SS began evacuating over 66,000 prisoners. These prisoners were forced to march westward through the bitterly cold Polish winter. Some traveled up to 39 miles to Wodzisław Śląski and others to Gliwice. The conditions were beyond brutal. Temperatures dropped as low as -20 degrees Celsius or -4 degrees Fahrenheit, and prisoners were given little to no food. Many, weakened by years of starvation and abuse, collapsed along the way. Those who could no longer walk were either shot on the spot or left to die in the freezing cold. These marches were not an isolated event. They occurred across multiple camps in the closing months of the war. In January 1945, approximately 50,000 prisoners were forced out of the Stutthof camp in northern Poland. Many were marched to the Baltic Sea, where SS guards forced them into the freezing water and machine-gunned them down. Those who survived this horrific ordeal were marched back to Stutthof, where thousands more perished due to exhaustion, exposure, and starvation. The total death toll from the Stutthof evacuations alone is estimated to be around 25,000. The chaos and desperation of the end of the war worsened the horrors of the death marches. SS guards, disorganized and often panicked, would frequently issue confusing or contradictory orders, leading to aimless and prolonged marches. As prisoners trudged through towns and villages, they faced not only the cruelty of the SS but also the hostility of local civilians, who sometimes joined in the violence. In some cases, entire groups of prisoners were massacred by their guards, rather than allowed to be liberated by the advancing Allied forces. One of the most poignant accounts from these marches comes from Hungarian Jewish poet Miklos Radnóti, who was shot to death during a death march in November 1944. Radnóti wrote poems during his imprisonment, capturing the agony and despair of these forced evacuations. His body, along with his poems, was discovered in a mass grave after the war. In total, it is estimated that around 250,000 concentration camp prisoners died during the death marches. Number 6. Drowning inmates in water tubs and bathing inmates to death. The sheer cruelty of the Nazi concentration camps knew no bounds, with some of the most horrific punishments being methods that exploited the very essence of life, water. In the horrifying world of the camps, water was not a source of life, but a tool of death. Between 1940 and 1942, in the notorious KZ Gusen camp, a new form of brutality emerged, drowning inmates in water tubs. The victims, often ill or unfit prisoners, were selected for this gruesome fate. SS guards and capos, including the infamous Capo van Leusen and Capo Klockman, along with a block elder named Schrogler, carried out these drownings. Inmates were forcibly submerged in water tubs or even small barrels, held under until they could no longer breathe. The horror didn't stop with drowning. A more sinister method of execution involved bathing inmates to death. This technique was devised by SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Chmielewski, who commanded KZ Gusen I camp from 1940 to 1943. Chmielewski sought a cheap yet torturous way to eliminate those who were too ill or exhausted to work. The method involved forcing large groups of prisoners, between 40 and 200 at a time, into the camp showers. SS Hauptscharführer Heinz Jentsch, Chmielewski's adjutant, would oversee this gruesome process. The prisoners were exposed to freezing cold water, often for 30 minutes or more, until their bodies could no longer withstand the frigid temperatures. As the icy water cascaded over them, hypothermia set in, leading to a slow, agonizing death. This brutal practice earned Jentsch the nickname Bademeister, meaning bath attendant, though his duties were far from those of a caretaker. By 1943, thousands of inmates had succumbed to this horrific method. Before we move on, here's today's subscriber's pick. The image you see is a glimpse into what punishment was like in Nazi concentration camps. Behind the barbed wire of these camps, unimaginable suffering was routine. One particularly harrowing method of punishment involved the relentless beating of prisoners, often until death. In the final days of KZ Gusen II, the brutality escalated to new extremes. Those deemed too ill or unfit were no longer transported to be killed by gas or heart injections. Instead, they met their end through savage beatings. Axes, sticks, and shovels turned into tools of death. On the night of April 23, 1945, in a final horrific act of cruelty, around 600 unfit inmates were brutally exterminated in this manner. This image serves as a chilling testament to the inhumanity that permeated these camps. What do you think about the cruelty of the concentration camp guards? Let us know in the comments section below. Number 5. Starvation and dark cells. Among the most brutal punishments faced by prisoners in the Nazi concentration camps were starvation and confinement in dark cells. Here, the body and mind were pushed to their absolute limits. One of the most feared locations in Auschwitz was Block 11. Known as the Block of Death, it housed some of the camp's most inhumane punishments. Here, prisoners who attempted to escape or were suspected of sabotage were often condemned to die slowly in the dark cells through starvation. These cells were windowless, with only small vents providing minimal air, and prisoners were forced to endure their final days in total darkness, lying on cold, bare floors. Starvation was used as a slow and agonizing method of execution. Prisoners selected for this punishment were often kept in these dark cells for weeks without food. The goal was to break their spirits completely, turning them into shadows of their former selves before death finally claimed them. In some cases, prisoners were taken hostage after another prisoner's escape and were starved as retaliation until the escapee was captured. The isolation was absolute. Prisoners could not see or communicate with others, amplifying their sense of hopelessness. The standing cells in Block 11 were another horrific form of punishment. These cells were so small, only about 1 square meter in size, that prisoners could do nothing but stand. Up to 4 prisoners were crammed into these tiny spaces, where they had to spend the night standing after a full day of forced labor. The air was scarce, with only a small vent providing minimal ventilation. Prisoners endured this torture for days or even weeks, and many did not survive. Starvation as a method of punishment was not limited to Auschwitz. It was a common practice across many Nazi camps. Prisoners who were considered unfit for work or who had committed minor infractions could find themselves cut off from food rations, leading to slow starvation. This was a deliberate tactic by the SS to eliminate those who were no longer useful to the Nazi war effort. Number 4. Harassment of women. Life for women in Nazi concentration camps was a nightmare beyond imagination. These camps were designed to break down every aspect of human dignity, and women were subjected to some of the most brutal and dehumanizing forms of harassment and abuse. Female prisoners, particularly in camps like Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, were often singled out for specific forms of cruelty simply because they were women. One of the most horrific aspects of life for women in these camps was the constant threat of sexual violence. SS guards took advantage of the extreme power imbalance to exploit female prisoners. Women were often forced into degrading situations, including being coerced into sexual acts in exchange for food, clothing, or even the hope of better treatment. Those who resisted were often brutally beaten or killed. The trauma of this abuse was compounded by the fact that many of these women were also separated from their families, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. The creation of brothels within some concentration camps added another layer of horror. These brothels were established by the Nazis as part of their twisted attempts to reward certain prisoners or to further degrade others. Women, many of whom were already physically weakened and mentally shattered, were forced into these brothels under the threat of violence. The conditions were appalling, and the women who survived this experience were left with deep psychological scars. It is estimated that thousands of women were forced into these brothels, where they were subjected to repeated sexual assaults. Harassment also took on other, less visible forms. Women were often subjected to humiliating body searches, where they were forced to strip naked and endure invasive examinations. These searches were not only a violation of their privacy, but also a means of exerting control and instilling fear. Women who were pregnant or who became pregnant in the camps faced particularly harsh treatment. Pregnant women were often subjected to forced abortions or were sent to the gas chambers as soon as their condition was discovered, as they were deemed unfit for labor. The role of female guards, known as Aufseherinnen, also contributed to the suffering of women prisoners. Many of these female guards were known for their extreme cruelty. Figures like Irma Grace, who served at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, became infamous for their brutality. These women, some of whom were as young as 17, enforced the Nazi regime's brutal policies with sadistic zeal. They participated in beatings, executions, and other forms of torture, often targeting women who were already weakened by starvation and illness. Despite these horrors, many women found ways to resist and support one another. They formed small, informal networks to share food, clothing, and information. Number 3, dragging, hanging, and throwing. Among the most horrific punishments inflicted on inmates were the torturous acts of dragging them along camp roads, hanging them on trees with their hands bound behind their backs, and throwing them down stone quarries. These acts were not just methods of punishment, but were deliberate attempts to break the spirit and dehumanize the prisoners. In the early days of the Gusen I concentration camp, dragging inmates along the camp roads was a particularly brutal form of punishment. Victims were typically those who had attempted to hide within the camp or had otherwise displeased the guards. These prisoners were dragged by their feet over the camp's rough, jagged stones, their bodies scraping against the ground. The sharp stones tore into their flesh, leaving them bloodied and broken. This practice wasn't just a physical torment, it was a psychological weapon designed to instill fear among the other inmates, reminding them of the brutal consequences of any disobedience. A method of punishment that harkened back to medieval torture was the hanging of inmates on trees. This was a common practice in Gusen I, where prisoners were hanged with their arms bound behind their backs. The agony was intense as the weight of their bodies pulled against their restrained limbs, often resulting in dislocated shoulders and broken bones. In some tragic instances, the victims were forgotten, left to hang until they died, an agonizing process that could take up to 30 minutes. The act of throwing inmates down stone quarries stands as one of the most horrific methods of execution in the concentration camps. At Gusen I, this was often carried out at the Kastenhof stone quarry, where Paul Wolfram, the desk chief of the quarry, was known to personally throw inmates to their deaths. This method was also used at the Mauthausen Central Camp's Wiener Graben quarry, where a sheer drop known as the parachutist's wall became a site of mass murder. The quarries were treacherous, and the act of being thrown over the edge almost always resulted in death, either from the fall or from the injuries sustained. The quarries at Gusen and Mauthausen are silent witnesses to the countless lives lost to this brutal practice. Number 2, treatment and extermination of children and priests. In the Nazi concentration camps, the most vulnerable were often the first to be targeted. Among these were children and priests, both of whom suffered immensely under the brutal regime. Children, the symbol of innocence and the future of any community, were seen by the Nazis as expendable if they belonged to groups they deemed undesirable. Jewish children were particularly targeted. Upon arrival at extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, the vast majority were immediately sent to the gas chambers. Beyond the immediate threat of extermination, children who were not killed upon arrival were often subjected to medical experiments. As discussed earlier, Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, performed horrific experiments on children at Auschwitz. These children were better fed and housed than other prisoners, not out of kindness, but to keep them alive for further experiments. Non-Jewish children were also not spared. Romani children, disabled children, and even non-Jewish children from occupied territories faced extermination or were used in brutal medical experiments. Thousands of Polish children were kidnapped for Germanization, while those who did not meet the Nazis' racial criteria were killed or subjected to horrific conditions. In February 1945, just months before the end of the war, some 420 Jewish children aged 4 to 7 were sent to the KZ Gusen camp. These innocent lives were cut short by SS doctors and their assistants, who exterminated them through heart injections. It is estimated that 1.5 million children were murdered during the Holocaust, nearly all of them Jewish. Priests, particularly those from Poland, also faced severe persecution in the camps. The Nazis viewed the clergy as a threat due to their moral authority and potential to resist Nazi ideology. Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp, became the primary site for incarcerating clergy. Over 2,700 priests were imprisoned there, with Polish priests making up a significant portion of this number. These men were subjected to the same brutal conditions as other prisoners, including forced labor, starvation, and medical experiments. Many priests were tortured or executed simply for maintaining their faith or opposing the regime. The situation was particularly dire for priests sent to KZ Gusen. In early 1940, many priests from Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen were transferred to KZ Gusen for extermination. Alongside Jewish inmates, priests were considered among the lowest-ranking prisoners and were often subjected to the private atrocities of SS men. Polish priests faced additional hardships, as they were forced to work in the stone quarry and were exposed to the harsh weather conditions. The average survival period for Polish priests in KZ Gusen was around 100 days. One particularly brutal incident occurred on August 13, 1940, when 2 prisoners from the Stone Quarry Command attempted to escape. As punishment, all the prisoners in the command, many of whom were priests, were forced to run all day long. By the evening, 14 of them were dead, nearly all priests. Number 1. Music as psychological torture. In the horrifying environment of Nazi concentration camps, music, often a symbol of joy and unity, was twisted into a tool of psychological torture. This dark transformation of music into an instrument of suffering reflects the depths of cruelty that the Nazis inflicted on their prisoners. At Dachau, one of the earliest Nazi concentration camps, music blared from loudspeakers during roll calls, mealtimes, and even torture sessions. The SS commanders understood that music could be used to manipulate the emotions and mental state of the prisoners, turning something inherently positive into a source of dread and despair. One particularly brutal form of this musical torture involved forcing prisoners to sing patriotic Nazi songs, like Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles, while enduring excruciating physical abuse. For many prisoners, this was a form of deep humiliation, as they were coerced into singing the very anthems that celebrated their oppressors. Additionally, prisoners were sometimes ordered to play cheerful music during executions, or as fellow inmates were marched to their deaths. In some camps, orchestras made up of prisoners were forced to play upbeat tunes, while new arrivals were led to gas chambers. These orchestras, sometimes composed of highly skilled musicians who were granted temporary reprieve from labor in exchange for their performances, became unwilling participants in the Nazis' machinery of death. For these musicians, the experience was torturous. Not only were they forced to witness the horrors inflicted upon their fellow inmates, but they were also made to contribute to the psychological torment of others. In addition to live music, the Nazis also utilized recorded music to reinforce their control over the prisoners. Loudspeakers would blast nationalist songs, often at deafening volumes, during roll calls and throughout the day. The psychological impact of this musical abuse was profound. Survivors have recounted how the enforced singing and constant exposure to jarring militaristic music wore them down mentally and emotionally. For some, the memories of these experiences haunted them long after liberation. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.